Hello and welcome to this training video from the EXP group. Now we're looking at CIMA E1 Enterprise Operations and we're on chapter 2 of our Express Notes. Now this chapter is all about governance and regulation. The first thing we're going to look at is to introduce us to stakeholders. Introduce us to the concept of stakeholders and something called stakeholder mapping. The first thing is what do we mean by stakeholders? A stakeholder is somebody that has an interest in an organization. And as we say here, stakeholders are individuals, groups or organizations that can impact or be impacted by an organization. In other words, they have an interest in that organization. We've classified stakeholders into three categories: internal, connected and external. Remember ICE, internal, connected, external. So an internal stakeholder would be employees or management of an organization. If you're an employee, the company you work for, then you are a stakeholder for that company. Connected, you're connected if you provide sources of finance. And the examples here would be shareholders and banks. And external, this would include the general public as well as the government. So stakeholders are internal, connected and external, classified into three categories. What we're going to have a look at now, something called a Mendelow's matrix. Mendelow's matrix refers to stakeholder mapping, and it allocates or maps stakeholders into quadrants according to the level of power and their interest. The level of power, how powerful are they in respect of the organization in which they're a stakeholder, and how interested are they, so how likely are they to exercise that power. Okay, let's move to the top of page 12 of the Express Notes, and here we have Mendelow's matrix, stakeholder mapping. So as I mentioned a moment ago, it looks at stakeholders' interest and stakeholders' power, and it judges it according to low and high, low and high. So if a stakeholder has got a low level of interest and a low level of power, when management look at how they should address those stakeholders, we have something called minimum effort. So in other words, management, when addressing the needs of these particular stakeholders in this quadrant, don't really do a lot. What about if a stakeholder's got a high level of interest and a low level of power? Well, for example, I've got a bank account with a bank, so I'm a stakeholder in that bank. What's my level of interest in that bank? It's pretty high because it's my money, my bank account with that bank. What's my level of power? Well, really, it's pretty low, isn't it? The level of power of an individual bank account holder is pretty low. So I would be a stakeholder falling into that quadrant with the bank where my bank account is. So the bank would keep me informed. They don't change their strategy for stakeholders in that quadrant, they just keep them informed. And in the example I gave then of my bank account, the bank would keep me informed by way of a bank statement, for example, or email messages. If we now look at stakeholders with a low level of interest but a high level of power. Now in a lot of situations this would be, for example, the tax authorities. Within most organisations, the tax authorities are a stakeholder. Their level of interest would be probably fairly low, but their level of power is pretty high. So the aim of the organisation here would be to keep these stakeholders satisfied. As long as the tax authorities are kept happy, kept satisfied, they won't exercise their high power. The final quadrant we're going to look at is high level of interest, high level of power. And according to Mendelow's matrix, these are the key players. So it's within this quadrant that management should focus their attention. They should make sure they look after stakeholders within that quadrant. Okay, let's move on to another key area of the syllabus. And this is all about corporate governance. Corporate governance, how an organisation is governed. One of the key things here, why this is becoming more and more important, is driven by the separation of ownership and control. The separation of ownership and control. In other words, if we look at this diagram here, the shareholders own a company. So they physically own it. They own the shares. It's their companies. But they appoint the directors who then control the company on a day-to-day basis. So we have a separation between the shareholders that own a company and the directors that control a company. Looking down here, we've just made a quick highlight point here that for a number of smaller companies, the shareholders and the directors may well be the same person or persons. But for larger companies, this separation of ownership and control can become a major issue. Because larger companies will almost certainly have separate shareholders, and in the case of quoted companies, for example, will have possibly thousands of shareholders. So what we've got to look at now is all about corporate governance. How is the company governed? So how can we ensure that this separation of ownership and control does not cause a problem for the shareholders, for the owners? If we look at the top of page 13, this highlights some of the key areas of corporate governance, some of the best practice areas of corporate governance. The first point to make sure you're comfortable with, you're aware of, is this concept of non-executive directors. So if you look at non-executive directors, these are, as the name suggests, the directors which are not the executive directors. The executive directors would be working on a day-to-day basis with an organisation. The non-executive directors, NEDs, sometimes known as non-execs, they are directors that are not involved in the day-to-day activities but would attend board meetings and are involved in some of the higher level, the strategic issues. They maybe give a certain independent viewpoint on the operation of the business. Next we've got Remuneration Committee. And this is a committee, so it's a group of people which has been established to decide, to determine the level of remuneration of the directors. So made up of non-executive directors, and it avoids a director deciding how much he or she is going to be paid. So it prevents them deciding how much they should be paid, which could benefit them if they pay an excessive amount, but would be detrimental to the shareholders, to the owners. Next committee to look at is the Audit Committee. As we say here, this acts as an interface between the directors and the external auditors. So, for example, it ensures that the auditors are paid a fair fee to ensure that they can do their job properly, because they're auditing the figures that the directors have prepared to better report back to the owners, the shareholders. Next one, we have public oversight. This enables the public, the general public, to get a view into the organisation. The example we've got here, for example, via public open days. And the final thing to look at here within corporate governance is from over in America. So in the US, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, commonly known as SOX. Now that sets various standards which are expected from all the US public company boards. And it's been driven really, it's a set of rules basis which was set up in response to a number of scandals which you probably heard of, for example Enron and WorldCom. Now SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley, is only applicable for US companies or for subsidiaries of US based companies. Okay, that completes this video. Thank you very much for listening.